Thanks, Walter, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone here for inviting me and actually giving me the honour of opening this great meeting. I know that the intention is to keep this discursive, so I'm only going to speak for 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a bit of a discussion and take some questions. And since I'm opening the session on populism, I thought I'd just recap what it is we think we mean by this. And I think, certainly in the Western world, 2016 was defined by two huge shocks, both of which have now been encapsulated under this slogan word, populism. The first, of course, was Brexit, the biggest blow, really, to the European Union since its foundation in 1957. And then there was the election of Donald Trump in the United States, something that people regarded as impossible, laughable even a year before it happened, and then it happened. And although Brexit and Trump had distinct local roots, there were also common themes which drove them forward and which are still in Western politics and which may continue to play out in the coming years. I think they will. So what were these themes? Well, one was a powerful backlash against globalization, a sense that this was an elite project that had benefited the rich, that had benefited foreigners outside the UK and the US, but that had not helped the common man. This was something that both the Brexiteers and Donald Trump pushed very hard. Because globalization was felt to be an elite project, there was also a powerful anti-elite element and an anti-expert element of it, which I think goes to this idea of populism. There was a famous quote in the Brexit campaign, like all famous quotes, wrenched ruthlessly out of context, but Michael Gove said, we're a bit tired of experts here in the UK, when it was put to him that experts said that Brexit was a bad idea. And, of course, that was an assault on the very idea, was interpreted as an assault on the very idea of learning, expertise. Why listen to these guys? In a much more extreme form, I think Donald Trump was doing that, so that there were many, many occasions during the campaign where people said, but that's not true. It didn't seem to matter. And Trump would indeed say, and continues to say to this day, well, that's the mainstream media, they lie, and so on. And things that would have finished off a conventional candidate in previous elections didn't matter because there was this anti-elite sentiment rolling. A third element of the populism that drove forward Trump and Brexit was hostility to immigration. In the UK, the sense that our borders were too open. In Trump's case, obviously, the demand for the war with Mexico. And obviously, given where we are, it's very important to note the very strong anti-Islamic element of both movements. Most obviously with Trump, where he at one point, as you'll recall, he promised to ban all Muslims from entering the United States, now modified to a ban just on 7 countries. But even in the UK, that element was there, because although this was a vote about free movement within the EU, one of the most potent arguments used by the Brexiteers was, well, Turkey may be about to join the EU, and then you'll have 70 million Muslims who can move to the UK. And I think, actually, the previous year, when 1 million refugees had arrived, mainly from Muslim countries, in Germany, had affected the tone of the debate in the UK, because the Brexiteers were able to say, look, these guys are all going to get passports, German passports, they'll be moving to Britain, and that also fed the anxiety in Britain. So you've had these two events. The question is, what happens now? Has populism got further to roll, and what will happen as a consequence of what we've already seen? Well, I think in the next couple of months, we're really going to get a sense in Europe of whether there is more momentum behind this. There are 2 very important elections coming up. The Dutch, I think, in a couple of weeks, where it is likely that Geert Wilders, who is a very Trump-style politician and has paid tribute to Trump and to Brexit, will win the elections in the sense that he will be the single largest party. But because the Dutch always form coalition governments, he's likely to be shut out of power, but still a very potent force affecting the tone of the debate. You can already see it in the way in which mainstream politicians in Holland are adopting some of his rhetoric. And then the most important one, because of the size and significance of France, the French presidential election in 2 rounds, April, May, when Marine Le Pen, who, again, in a Trump style, would have been pretty unthinkable that she could have been president. I think people now are thinking about it as a strong possibility. She has consciously placed herself in the same sort of stream of thought as Trump and Brexit. She's paid tribute to Brexit, said it's an example for France. She said the election of Trump was the dawn of a new era. And at the moment, it looks like she'll win the first round, but then, in the way that the National Front have always done in previous years, lose in the second round because there has been a pretty solid majority against far-right politics in France. But I think one can be less sure that that will be the result now, because the themes that Le Pen is using have proved their potency in Britain and America: anti-Islamic sentiment, anti-immigration sentiment, anti-globalization sentiment. And frankly, the French elite are more or less, it's almost as they're conspiring to validate Marine Le Pen's thesis, because there's a massive corruption scandal that is currently crippling François Fillon, who was until quite recently thought to be the likeliest next president. And so the person Le Pen will face off against is a guy called Emmanuel Macron, whose CV looks like it could be constructed to be an epitome of the global elite. He's went to ENA, which is the top French university, and then he worked for Rothschilds as a banker and so on. He's very pro-globalization, pro-immigration. He's a big fat target for Le Pen. I still think she'll lose, but then I said I thought Trump would lose, so we'll see. What happens in France and Holland will then determine, and this is where we get onto the consequences of populism, the future of the EU. And the future of the EU matters to the future of the West and indeed the world. Why? Because it's been a very intense effort to form a kind of new political system to replace the system that produced so many wars in Europe's past. It's very closely associated with globalization, with open trade. And it's been a 70-year project. If it were to fall apart now, I think Europe would be in disarray, and the United States would have to rethink its whole approach to the Western world. And yet it's possible. I think the EU can survive the Britain leaving because we've always been a kind of peripheral member, although it's a big blow for the UK to leave. But if France were to leave, and Le Pen says she wants France to, she kind of goes backwards and forwards, but at various times she's talked about France leaving both the European single currency and the EU. I think if that were to happen, the EU is over. And you're then back to a system of nation states within Europe. With Trump, again, I was just talking to Neil beforehand, we don't really know how much of his agenda he's actually going to deliver on, because, again, he goes backwards and forwards. At one point he says NATO is obsolete. Then earlier this week, he was speaking in Congress and saying NATO is absolutely marvelous and had defeated fascism, which is quite a claim, given it was only formed in 1949. But Trump, if you take at least some of his rhetoric literally, is challenging two of the basic pillars of the post-war order that Walter referred to. The first is the American alliance system, on which the whole global security architecture is based. He's questioned not only NATO, but America's alliances in Asia. He's said that Japan and South Korea have been ripping off America. And he takes essentially, at least rhetorically, a very transactional approach to security, almost as if the Americans were mercenaries who need to be hired by their allies rather than supporting their allies in the traditional way. So if he were to do that, then the traditional security architecture that the West has supported is really crumbling. The other aspect that Trump has challenged is obviously free trade and open trade. And again, his rhetoric, at least overtly, he is the most protectionist American president I can remember in my lifetime. He's rejected the whole idea, endorsed by both Republicans and Democrats, that spreading free trade, spreading capitalism, this has been really the American credo since 1945. Trump has said, not at all, it's destroyed American living standards. Steve Bannon, who's turned out to be maybe one of the most interesting thinkers inside the White House, a lot of people are trying to work out what he believes, said that essentially what America had done through open trade was to create a middle class in Asia, but to destroy the middle class in America. And if you follow through on that logic, you will have the kind of tariffs that Trump has been talking about. Sometimes he's even talked about tariffs of up to 45%. There's a question of a border tax. And then just this week, the Americans were talking about, or the Trump administration was talking about, potentially just ignoring World Trade Organization rulings that went against the United States. Now, if they do that, then the global architecture that America created that the wise men who were written about would be crumbling, essentially. And America would have turned on the project that it itself has created since 1945. And that would be a consequence of the populism and the sense of revolt against the established order that Trump has capitalized on. But I'll leave it now, and we'll continue the conversation.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the shout out to the wise men.
No, if you missed the reference, there was to a great book that I actually read it in graduate school in the mid-'80s. I think it came out.
I always hate when people say, I read your book when I was a student. It
was being assigned in Princeton. It's all about this group of people, the wise men. It was Kennan, Atchison, and others who formulated the post-war order. And in a way, I think Trump is a revolt against this idea of rule by wise men.
Totally, both in terms of rule by wise men and the notion of a globalization world order. You painted what seemed to be a dire consequence, and I'm going to ask you a few questions about why it's so dire. You start with number one, that if France comes out of the EU, it is the end of that European order, and we'll go back to having nation states in Europe. Why is that a bad thing?
It's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, and I suppose like a lot of Brits, I have been a nation-stater and have been suspicious of some of the supranational ambitions of the EU. I did think that creating the euro was a mistake, and I think that's been vindicated. However, what I was not willing to do was go the next step and say, therefore, one should destroy the EU. And that's for two reasons. Although I think creating the euro was a mistake, actually I think that it would be an even bigger mistake, sadly, to destroy it, because I can't think of any way of doing it without triggering a financial crisis. So that if Le Pen were to say we're restoring the franc, I think you would get capital flight from France, you would get bank collapses, and if there were a neat way of doing it, I think actually it wouldn't be a bad idea to go back to national currencies, but I'm not sure it's doable. But the broader question is, why would the EU, getting rid of the EU, be a bad thing? And there I think my position has changed, I mean, partly through working in Europe, and I've begun to take more serious an argument I used to dismiss, that there is a connection between the European Union and the establishment of peace in Europe. There were many factors, but the EU...
Wait, are you implying that if France pulls out, you could have France and Germany go to a war again?
Look, not tomorrow. But, if you talk to French people, they will come up with that idea quite spontaneously. Actually.
Right, it is true that wars are caused by nationalism in many cases.
Yeah, but also that maybe, I mean, you see, I think that the British interpretation of what went wrong in Europe, and which is one of the reasons we never really saw the point of the EU, was that it was all to do with, the Germans went a bit crazy twice and they had to be whopped on the head by the Brits and the Americans, and that was it. Whereas I think the European interpretation was that there was something wrong with the system of European states, that it was persistently producing wars, not just in the 20th century, but the 19th, 18th century. And therefore, the most ambitious views of the EU was that it was trying to create a new system that transcended this system of national rivalries that created states. I don't buy it in its fullest version, but I do believe in the EU as a form of compelling European states to cooperate and to talk to each other very intensively. And I think if that was lost, A, the process would be extremely acrimonious and would begin to feed national rivalries and angers. But also I just think, however tedious and irritating the EU is, it's very good that the leaders of the biggest states have to meet every 6 months at least and try to discuss and sort out their differences in a cooperative way. And if that goes, I do worry about the future.
I mean, Neil will be talking later. I assume Dr. Kissinger traces back, the Treaty of Westphalia, right, where we had a whole system of governance for almost half a millennium based on nation states and the sovereignty of them. And that worked quite well. It seems to be working maybe now better than this new world order.
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't think it's a complete either-or. There are. I mean, I don't think one side has all the arguments. And I was interested when Trump said, one's always searching for ideas beneath all the verbiage. When he said, look, it's nations that matter, it's nations that work.
Correct.
And I think behind that is a legitimate thought that if you believe in democracy, a global democracy is not going to work. There isn't enough of a community. That democracies work at a nation-state level or below, where there's, as they say, an imagined community that will accept being outvoted. And if you move too much decision-making to the supranational level, people feel they're disenfranchised.
Speaking of democracy, I'm going to now ask you the broadest of philosophical questions about populism, which is there something basically incompatible with democracy and capitalism coexisting as one system that leads to a populist revolt?
No.
Where there are winners and losers in a capitalist system, and sometimes the middle gets disenfranchised, and then you have a vote.
No, I mean, I've always thought that democracy and capitalism were quite closely related, actually,
Right.
because they're both about choice. They're about saying we're not going to impose on you our vision, that you as voters get to choose your leaders, and you as voters get to choose how you spend your money. And that that actually authoritarian regimes very frequently crack down on the free market system because they don't like the idea of people having that degree of choice in their private life, because it begins to have political implications. It wasn't an accident that the most extreme authoritarian systems in communist China and Russia clamped down on freedom of choice, even in the market. But I think that there may be some incompatibility, or not incompatibility, but difficulty between very internationalized capitalism and democracy, because to have the free flow of goods, to have the free flow of people, you have to have international rules that one country alone can't change without withdrawing from the system. And in a sense, what Brexit is about is one country saying, we're actually no longer prepared to accept these international rules, the costs of it are too high, and so we are withdrawing from the system. And what the Brits are hoping is that they will get the good bits, the free trade, but not the rules that were agreed at the EU level. At the moment, the EU are saying, sorry, you can't have both.
But let me ask you then the Steve Bannon question that you quoted, which is all these rules, all this internationalism. You could make the argument, and certainly Mr. Bannon has made the argument, that it's created a middle class in Asia and destroyed a middle class from Newcastle, England to Newton, Iowa. And that middle class has been decimated, and that it would be better off if you didn't have free trade and you protected your middle class. What is wrong with that argument?
I think it's got elements of truth in it, more perhaps than people like us recognized, in the sense that you worked at The Economist for 15 years, and I remember when this whole era was dawning with NAFTA and so on, we just dismissed out of hand the idea that this would drive down wages in the West. It was regarded as a massive oversimplification, and I think clearly there's an element of truth in it. But I think it is an oversimplification for numbers of reasons. First of all, it's not all been bad. You know, all the cheap goods that you buy at Walmart, in the sense living standards are supported by, you know, the fact that your T-shirt costs $5 is partly because of a globalized
Yeah, and there's not a
system.
Constituency built in for that. People don't.
No, but people take the benefits for seriously.
Yeah.
The people take the benefits for granted, and so that I think the Brits will only realise what we've lost economically from the EU when, you know, factories perhaps start moving because actually they relied on global supply chains, when your cup of coffee costs a lot more because the cheap European labour isn't there anymore. There's that. I think the other things, just briefly, that have contributed to the problems of the middle class are not totally to do with globalization, they're to do with technology.
Why, do you think technology costs jobs as opposed to create jobs?
Well, historically, in the long run, it hasn't. You know, so that the mechanization of farms led to a lot of people losing jobs on farms, but eventually they get jobs elsewhere. But I think that certainly the factory jobs that Bannon and Trump seem to have in their minds, I don't think, unless costs go up enormously, that you're going to replace Asian workers with American workers by and large, or replace them with robots.
Well, you said that, you know, the benefit is that you can go to Walmart on a Sunday evening and buy a flat-screen TV set for very little money compared to what it would have been otherwise. But if you have that option, but then the next morning, that Monday morning, you don't get to take the early morning bus to a $30 an hour job that has secure benefits because that's all been done. Yeah. Have you won or have you lost?
Well, I mean, you know, obviously enough voters feel that they've lost, although one has to remember that the margins are very narrow. You know, we're in 50-50 societies now. Right. The Clinton...
I'm just asking you, not the American voter. Right?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think everybody makes their judgment in different ways. But the other thing I want to say is that some of the insecurity is to do with competition, but some is to do with policy choices in Europe and America. you could have a more redistributive tax system. You could have much cheaper education. I mean, I think the burden of student loans on Americans is a big, big concern.
So in other words, we could have had the globalization but distributed the benefits more equitably, and we'd be in a better place.
Well, you touched on that in your introduction, and I was thinking, I'm not sure what I think about that. I think you could have a more moderated globalization. It may be that there's something inherent in it that actually does make the lives of the relatively unskilled in the West, and maybe now of the semi-skilled, less comfortable. But I think that relates to this whole question of global equity, because I think one of the incoherences in the left's approach to globalization when they condemned it was they tended to say it's bad for everybody. It's bad for the West, but it's also bad for Asians. I think it's manifestly not been bad for Asians. There's been enormous reductions in poverty in Asia, and that's because you've created a global labor market. They've been able to compete. They've been able to improve their lives. And sure, some of that has come at the cost of the West. But it's not it's not all lost for the West at all. I think it's a very mixed picture.
My last question before we open it up is the role of social media and new digital media in exacerbating this divide and allowing populism.
Well, we're only just beginning to sort of feel our way into what it all means. But, I mean, I think that what it's to do, again, is this challenge to authority. The idea, which may be, if you're right for the Financial Times, you think it's a very bad idea because we like being authoritative and unquestioned. But I think that you're getting a whole proliferation of narratives out there and counter-narratives, some of which is good and democratizing, but some of which has been made it easy to proliferate what's known as fake news now. It's straight-out crazy stuff, which then begins to infect politics. So, Trump was such a blizzard, it's hard to remember everything he did. But there was one moment that really, for me, encapsulated what I objected to about his campaign, which was when Chief Justice Scalia died. And Trump said, he was found with a pillow over his face, he might have been murdered.
Yeah.
This was crazy stuff, which normally in the past, a politician who said that would have been out.
Although he also was the one who said that Obama was not necessarily born in America.
Absolutely.
And he didn't get
and many other things, that McCain was not a war hero, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
We kept thinking,
But I think that the thing was that Trump was picking up stuff that was on social media and that was in an echo chamber of social media. So it didn't matter if the New York Times or CBS News said, actually, Scalia wasn't murdered, because enough people thought he was, or had read it on Twitter or Facebook, that he had a whole different audience out there.
This echo chamber of fake news or an echo chamber of just weird things out there, I think is quite important, and we should be discussing it more, along with a concept that I hadn't thought about that came up last night in one of the discussions, which is the weaponization of fake news, now that Iran has gotten in the game, as well as, obviously, Russia. Yeah. Gideon, thank you for a wonderful session.